time to get serious, because one thing we like to do here in Talk Towers is give you truth bombs that other media stations simply won't do. Now, a lot of you will have seen the pictures of all of the migrants landing in Lampedusa, that small island off the coast of Sicily, 70 miles away from the northern coastline of Africa. Around 150 vessels arriving on one day simultaneously. The number of migrants now in Lampedusa massively eclipses their entire population. I think it's around 6,000 arrived one day, and a similar number as the other, and the population of the island itself is only about 3,000. So what is going on here? Has everyone in Africa suddenly decided, oh, do you know what, I'm going to get in a boat today and go to Italy, or is something else at play? Well, something no other media is talking about in this country, and I think it's high time that we did, is what some people in Italy are saying. And not just some people. I'm talking about Antonio Tajani, who is the former president of the European Parliament, a man who once chastised me for waving a union flag in the hemicycle, as it happens. Who also now happens to be the Italian Foreign Minister, and also the Italian Defense Minister, Guido Crosetto. What do you think they've been saying about the migratory flows across Africa and into Italy? Well, they are saying that they are blaming Russia's Wagner mercenary group for provoking a rise in migration from Africa to Italy. In a statement, Defense Minister Guido Crosetto called Russia's use of mercenaries as proxies on countries supporting Ukraine a clear strategy of hybrid warfare that has led to migrants making the journey across the Mediterranean. I'm joined now by Benedict Spence, who's with me in the studio. I mean, Benedict, we keep hearing the narrative all the time that all these people are leaving, fleeing war, they're fleeing persecution, so on and so forth. I'm sure a great many of people who have made these perilous crossings may well be fleeing war and persecution. But I think what we're seeing definitely now in Africa is something a bit different.
I mean, there is no doubt that there is a lot more conflict going on in the Sahel region than there was even 6 months ago. But, of course, the first thing to point out is that that is all related, or a lot of it is at least, related to the activities of Wagner and other Russian irregulars in overthrowing governments, in trying to put other people in power. It's old-school colonialism is what it is doing, and that is in a bid to get a hold of rare earth minerals and natural resources, uranium, if it happens to be Niger, for instance. That is causing a lot of upheaval. A lot of people are moving, but there's no real sort of great incentive to keep those people there, because they are largely people without prospects. A lot of, it's not as if there's sort of booming economies in this particular part of Africa. You've got a sort of very limited amount of industries, and that is what Wagner and its approximates wish to control. There is this byproduct. The byproduct is the mass movement of human beings, and that is moving northwards predominantly towards Libya, which happens to, of course, be a failed state that has two warring sides, one of which just happens to be backed by Russia. And that is, of course, where we're seeing a lot of the people flowing from to Europe. And the suggestion here is, of course, that this is a form of sort of grey zone warfare, hybrid warfare. And it's not as if it's without precedent, because if anybody wants to go back to the period of time between the fall of Afghanistan and the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of Afghans were being ferried not along the route through Turkey and Greece into Europe. Actually, they were going north, and it was being facilitated by Russia. Russian authorities were saying to people, look, you can come north from Afghanistan, you go across our country, and you'll enter Europe via Belarus. And the Polish government closed the border. They had the razor wire fences, the dogs, the army deployed there, and they said absolutely not. And they were chastised for it, especially in Germany. They were told that they were being inhuman, that this was a brutal thing to do, not to allow all of these terrified Afghan migrants to come across their border. But the Poles knew exactly what was going to go on. The reason why these people were being brought along this route was so that they
weren't they?
Well, they were, and the reason why was so that these people would end up taking the refugee resources that the Poles knew, sotto voce, they were going to need for the Ukrainians. It was all part of a wider plan to say, well, we're going to try and sow as much discord and as much havoc to try to persuade the publics of Europe to say, no, we can't be backing this war. There has to be peace with Russia because we've got too many issues on our hands, and we don't have the facilities for all of these Ukrainians. They've got to stay where they are. It was all part of the plan. So we have seen this sort of behaviour before. But as you say, this isn't the sort of thing that is touched upon broadly in Western Europe. Why? Because it flows completely against the narrative that it is good and proper to let everybody come in who says that they are fleeing persecution. It cannot possibly be that, even if these people themselves do not have ulterior motives, it cannot possibly be that somebody else is facilitating it with ulterior motives, because then that justifies the nasty racists saying you can't let them in.
Exactly. I mean, I'm going to bring in now Philip Ingram, former senior military intelligence officer. If any man's going to have an idea of what could or could not be going on, it will be him. Philip, thank you so much for coming on the show. I mean, for me, when someone like Antonio Tajani, who is the foreign minister of Italy and largely regarded across the continent as a very credible character, is saying, backing up this idea that Wagner could have their hand in, curating, corralling, choreographing migrant corridors, I mean, perhaps we should take him a bit seriously. Do you think this is plausible?
Well, there's an element of truth to it. That's the trouble with all of these statements. But how much is behind it is the key thing. You know, the one thing that is very clear is Vladimir Putin is using grain, is using food, is using starvation across the globe as a weapon to try and influence global opinion on what's going on inside Ukraine and global support for Ukraine against Russia. He wants to try and undermine that. That's why he's pulled out from the Black Sea grain deal, and that's why he has been threatening world food, and that's why food prices have gone through the roof. That in itself it's got a massive impact across Europe, but you and I and the majority of people in Europe and the United States can afford the price rises. The people who can't afford it are those in sub-Saharan Africa, in the poorest countries in the world, and those are the ones that he's having greatest impact on. As soon as you get economic downturn in those sorts of countries, that increases the flow of economic migrants who will say that they're fleeing persecution and everything else, but we know that the majority of the individuals that are coming in are trying to better themselves and get opportunities to be able to feed their families and everything else. But they're being exploited by the serious and organised criminals. Here's where Wagner comes in. Everything that comes out of Russia is underpinned by an organised crime gang. Wagner is the executive arm of one of the organised crime gangs that backs Vladimir Putin, that backs the Russian regime, and they will be exploiting this where they can. But Italy is suffering more than most countries, and that's why we'll see, the Prime Minister of Italy trying to sensationalise or make sensational statements, or just put something into a soundbite that I think will translate well across Europe in international politics, because politics is done by soundbites now, not substance.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because certainly, Maloney actually has been quite quiet on this topic. And the reason I sort of point out it being Tajani as the former president of the European Parliament is because he is widely regarded as a credible man, as a sensible man, as a man that people can believe, a bit of a veteran of Italian politics. And having read around this subject, I speak to, a few people here and there, I think what people are looking at is that just the sheer numbers, what happened over the last few days, I mean, the week before last, when about 150 vessels turned up simultaneously, and people were saying, well, this somehow now looks quite sophisticated. Are we just looking for the bogeyman of Russia everywhere, and we're giving them way too much credibility? And like you say, that Wagner essentially lining their pockets with cash, and, people, traffickers get paid quite a lot of money for, ferrying people routes across Africa and across oceans and so forth. Or, would we be right to at least keep in mind the idea that this could be part of the Kremlin's playbook to destabilise the West, to sort of provoke, the following of non-mainstream parties in the West to disrupt our politics? And perhaps we should be alive to there could be a narrative going on here that we should be talking about.
Well, the thing that underpins everything in Russian politics is organised crime. The oligarchs are multi-billionaires across the globe, but not because they are astute businessmen, but because they carry out businesses where they can pocket as much money from the Russian government sources and other government sources as they can. They're allowed to do that because Vladimir Putin is the oligarch-in-chief and enables them to do it by not prosecuting them. And their organised crime tentacles stretch across the globe, in particular into sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular through the organised crime gangs that are working there. Are 100% of those that are coming up through Libya and all the rest of it being pushed through by Russia or anything else? No. Is it a good percentage? Almost certainly yes. Is Vladimir Putin trying to use the movement of people as a weapon to try and influence the West? Yes, he'll be trying to do that if he can do it. And has he got the mechanism in place to do that? He has, through the organised crime links that are there. So, it's a mixture between the two. It's easy to bring him out as the bogeyman, but he is involved. There are other bogeymen involved as well.
How worried should we be in the West about this? I mean, is it just about destabilising politics and creating sort of divisions within societies and distracting the West and putting pressure on Western leaders to deal with the crisis, meaning we're less able to deal with others? Or could there be genuine security threats involved?
There are massive security threats involved. They will be infiltrating. Some of the individuals that are coming up will have Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliations. They will have terrorist links that are in there. There's clear evidence in the past of terrorists being brought in through the migration routes that are in there. And if not terrorists, there's clear indication of people with serious criminal backings coming in. And that's not through the Wagner bit. We've seen that from a number of the individuals that are coming from Albania, requiring the UK government to get a special negotiation with Albania to send ethnic Albanians back again. But we've got people who've been convicted of rape and murder in Albania who have managed to get through these refugee routes and cross the channel into the UK. And whenever someone comes in and says they've lost their identity documents, then they are a blank sheet of paper until the authorities manage to check and see if there's anything in their DNA or their biometric profile or anything else that can identify them through the international security mechanisms. But that might be too late. They might have disappeared into society. So the majority of people that are coming in are genuine, whether they be genuine economic migrants or whether they be genuine refugees fleeing persecution. But there is a percentage of them who are abusing the system, and they're abusing the system because they've got ulterior motives, whether those be criminal, whether those be terrorist, or whether those be supporting a hostile state. And they're going to spoil it for those that are genuinely in need.
Yeah, I mean, stay there, Felix. I want to come back to you in a second. But as we're all here together discussing this issue, and I think we all agree that this is serious and we need to get real about quite who might be coming into the country, for what purpose, and who's enabling them to do this. Politicians don't have an answer to this, so I wanted to see if we could formulate some sort of answer. If we were advising government on what should be done, if we were saying to Ursula von der Leyen or Giorgia Meloni or whoever, look, this is how you should best tackle the problem, I mean, what would you be saying to them?
Specifically in terms of people coming from North Africa and that route, or just in general?
I think in general.
The only way that you're going to be able to sort of 100% close off the possibility of people coming from various reasons is to be a lot more aggressive about not letting in a vast amount of people. And I'm afraid that probably means a lot of genuine refugees, a lot of economic migrants. If you want to be sort of 100% secure, well, that's almost the only way of doing it. But I don't think that's realistic. So you're probably going to end up in a situation where you just have to sort of take a lot of these people and just hope that you are properly funding your security services. I mean, because, as I say, the Western countries are addicted now to cheap labour coming from all parts of the world. And whether you want to dress that up as sort of economic migrants or refugees or whatever, that is ultimately why we take people. Even a lot of people, and that's why we're happy to sort of wade through a lot of people who say that they're refugees and we don't necessarily check very well, because it is all about getting in as much cheap labour as possible. So we're not going to sort of wean ourselves off that. So you are just going to end up taking lots of these people. That's going to involve criminality, that's going to involve terrorist actors, that is going to involve hostile states. That is the price you pay for deciding to have what is effectively an open border policy. And we've got to recognise, actually, the British government right now is trying to sign a free trade agreement with India, which is right now in the crosshairs of the global community because it's just assassinated a dissident on Canadian soil. Now, if Russia had done that, or Saudi Arabia or Iran, everybody would be furious. But you notice there's not that much anger because we're trying to sign a trade deal with
Not just that, at one point, one of the biggest cohorts coming over on the small boats
were
men
Indian.
from the Punjab, and I've had it suggested to me that they could be connected to the pro-Khalistan movement, various pro-Khalistan organisations which are outlawed, prescribed in almost every other country in the world, but not the UK. So there's also, another complex topic to be discussed there. Philip, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but as a man who has, been part of NATO's you were sort of advisor to NATO, part of NATO, who, of course, are sort of keenly interested in defending Europe's frontiers, amongst other things. What do you think the solution is, or what might you be advising politicians? Because Meloni at one stage was talking about a naval blockade, which a lot of people might raise their eyebrows and go, well, that's really heavy-handed. But, I mean, what on earth can politicians do? What should world leaders be considering?
The trouble is, the more barriers governments put in place, the more initiative the serious and organised criminal gangs will use, and they will always get round it. They will always find a way around it. So, I agree with harder measures. I agree with us having to be firmer with people that do come in from an illegal perspective. I agree with what the EU is doing, what the UK is doing, and all the rest of it in trying to increase the amount of aid that's going into the different camps in the different countries where people are coming from to try and stop the flow of traffic. There's the old Nelson Mandela saying, if you are sick of pulling people out of the river, go upstream and find out why they're falling into it in the first place. And that's what we need to be doing. However, we need to have other mechanisms. In the UK specifically, I think if we decided that we had places in 2 or 3 countries around the world where people could legally go and apply for asylum, then we can turn around and say that those that illegally cross the channel in little boats and all the rest of it, we can take them and we can send them off to Africa. And we can do that morally because we have a process where people can go to somewhere, there's an office, and actually have a legal mechanism for getting into the country. That's where the debate is at the moment, and that would take a lot of the sting out of things politically in the UK. The EU itself, I think when Angela Merkel opened the borders a few years ago, what she did was she undermined the whole of the EU's approach to it. And what we're finding is that individual nations within the EU, Italy in particular, are caught in this dilemma between what they feel that they need to do to protect themselves nationally and what they're being forced to do under the EU rules and EU legislation, working together as a collective. This is where there's a real danger that it will continue to cause friction in the EU, and we'll see an increase of right-wing political parties coming in that could eventually end up in the fracture of the EU. Putin sees that, and Putin will be sticking his proverbial knife into the crack and wiggling it as much as he can to try and create those fractures.
Yeah, I have no doubt about that. Philip, thank you so much for joining me. Absolutely fascinating insights there. And yeah, a topic I think that we really do need to be talking about, that other people aren't talking about. I'm amazed, actually, that apart from... It was in The Independent, all credit where credit is due. The Independent did write the story about Italy blaming Russia's Wagner group for the surge in migrants. But I think it's a very important part of the narrative. And if we don't talk about these things, and if we're not just honest and pragmatic about things like this, then we could be putting our country and indeed the continent at risk.